According to this letter from January 1997 from my first hair transplant surgeon, that my first procedure had gone extremely well. Well, the issue was, I completely disagreed. Welcome to part 2 of my hair transplant story. If you watched part 1, that video was all about how I came to have a hair transplant and what led up to that. So this video is all about my first hair transplant. I'm going to explain to you what happened. My memory is a little bit fuzzy about what actually happened, but I do remember a lot of the key details. I'm going to be explaining to you exactly how many grafts I had, where they were placed, and the surgeon that performed the procedure. So I was desperate. Really desperate. I had aggressive hair thinning and I didn't know where to turn. If you remember from the first video also, I'd mentioned that I'd recently lost my dad, so I didn't have anyone to talk to about this at all. Majority of my friends all had full heads of hair. My life was consumed with my hair loss. Checking my hair in the mirror on multiple times a day. Checking reflections in a shop when you walk past to see what your hair looks like. Avoiding sitting under bright spotlight. Choosing the best place to sit in a restaurant or in a pub. Always aiming to sit with your back towards the wall, so people couldn't walk around behind and see just how thin you were on top of your head. When the Spice Girls and Oasis were riding high in the top of the UK charts and everyone was excited about Euro 1996, I was planning my first hair transplant. I had this on 8th of July 1996 with Dr. Michael May. How did I do my research? Well, I was recommended him by a trichologist in Eastbourne, the hometown. Back in 1996, there was no internet, there was no forums, there was no Reddit, there was no YouTube, there was no way of researching who was good. So a personal recommendation from an industry expert, such as a trichologist, was the best way that I could go. I do vaguely remember the consultation. I remember a big oak desk, leather bound, typical old school. I remember Dr. May being in a suit. I vaguely remember him asking him what I wanted. Obviously, I said to him, I just want more hair. I'm losing my hair rapidly. I don't remember any conversation about treatments that I could try at that point. I think he gave me a brief assessment, sort of checking my hair briefly in my donor area and also on the recipient area. And then he said, yeah, we could do 450 mini and micrografts. I mean, looking back, it was just pure desperation that sold me that first hair transplant. There was no results to look at other than this result that Michael May showed me in an actual photo album of photographs of this patient that he'd done. That over a number of procedures, we've managed to get this guy a full head of hair. I remember thinking it looked pluggy. I remember thinking this didn't quite look like real hair, but he had hair. All I kept thinking about was, I'm going to be bald. If I don't do something like this, I'm going to be bald. I'd tried treatments, that didn't work. I'd gone and looked at a hair system, that wasn't for me. A hair transplant at this point was my only option. Now, you might be wondering, well, why didn't you just shave your head? You were aggressively losing your hair in your early 20s. Why didn't you just shave it? Because shaving your head came with connotations. It wasn't as acceptable then as it is today. I wore a suit for work and a shaved head just didn't give the right impression. It's a real shame, because if I had have gone down the route of shaving my head, it could have been a completely different story. Well, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you about my 8 hair transplants, that's for sure. All I kept thinking about was, if I lose my hair, I'm going to look old. I won't be as attractive to the opposite sex. How's it going to affect my dating? You know, it was consuming me to the point where I chose to avoid certain situations where I couldn't wear a hat or I felt uncomfortable. I just didn't want to look older. I would have done anything at that point, and unfortunately I did. The day arrived. I can't remember much about the actual procedure itself. Not surprisingly, this was 30 years ago. Dr. May came in, spoke to me briefly, and he drew my hairline. And this is how he drew it. That quickly. He then left. I remember saying to him, "What's that?" And he said, "That's your new hairline." Off he went for me to sit there on my own, looking at this hairline that actually was about an inch above my native hairline at the time. So my hairline, and we'll put some old pictures up, you can see my hairline was probably about here, just above my frown line, and it was pretty straight and even slightly rounded here. I used to have a little bit of a widow's peak. And he drew the hairline just above that. I was a diffuse thinner, so my hairline was still intact. It had thinned and you could see through it, but my hairline was still present. I wanted my hairline rebuilt at the point where I could see it, where it used to be. And I've had this conversation with so many patients over the years, not to rebuild your juvenile hairline, but that's exactly what I wanted. So when Dr. May came back in again, I had this discussion with him and he said, this will suit you as you get older. Now, that was probably the best advice that Dr. May did in terms of the whole procedure. Now, the issues with my hairline at the time was that it was still too low, really, for my eventual Norwood 6 hair loss pattern. He'd taken so little time to draw it that he left it crooked. It's always been slightly lower on this side than this side. Now, I've taken many attempts to try and fix that, which we'll get onto in future videos, but the hairline was crooked. Asymmetry is really important when you're designing a hairline because most people have a brow which is slightly higher than the other one. It's true for me. However, it was very obviously crooked. It's actually quite ironic that the thing I criticized him most at that time for designing me a hairline that was too high was the smartest thing that he did for me. Now, we'd planned for 450 million micrografts. The industry itself was just moving away from the old plug graft surgery of the 1970s and the 1980s. This is where large artificial groups of between 5 and 10 hairs were taken out using a big punch directly from the donor area and placed directly into the recipient area. And that's kind of where the term plugs or doll's hair appearance came from. So minion micrografts were a major improvement at the time and considered sort of state of the art. So what happened was a strip of tissue, in my case, a strip down the side here, was removed under local anaesthetic. That piece of tissue was then passed over to the nurse, and that was then trimmed into groupings. Now, microscopes weren't used, and that's the big differentiator between minion micrografts and follicular unit transplantation, or FUT. Micrografts contained between 2 to 3 hairs, and mini grafts contained between 3 to 5 hairs. The important thing is that these grafts weren't naturally occurring follicular units, but at the time this was considered state-of-the-art surgery and a big improvement from the plug surgery. So when I walked into the clinic, I wasn't having outdated procedure at the time. It was the latest procedure that was available. The issue is that whilst it was a big development on the old plug surgery, it still didn't look natural because they weren't dissected using microscopes. The issue was with my procedure is that only 450 grafts were used. So at the time I paid £1,500, and in today's money that works out about £3,600, I'm told. So if you divide that by 450, that's actually over £8 per graft. The big issue with the procedure was that trying to spread 450 grafts over a very large area. So I was thinning all over the entire top of my scalp with quite a low hairline. So how did you do that? Well, you had to place those grafts really far apart. The other issue for me is that I've got coarse hair. So when you put 3 to 4 hairs together, it looks really artificial. But what would have happened is that they probably would have used needles, I suspect, and there was no control over the angle and direction of the hair growth. And you can see that in a moment. The hairs just used to stick up. They were also bunched together. So when they grew out like branches of a tree. So it looked really artificial and it was incredibly difficult to style my hair. So the strip was removed, passed off to the nurse to cut into groupings, the minion micrografts, and then the grafts were placed. I only remember the pain of the numbing injections. Most of the work was done by the nurse. I saw very little of Michael Major during the whole procedure. I remember he popped back in the afternoon to ask how it was going and had some agreeable nods about, yeah, looking good. Yeah, this is going to be good, you know, that kind of thing. I remember having very minimal involvement with him in terms of the planning. He drew the hairline. He may have removed the strip. I can't remember, but most of the work was carried out by a nurse. The other thing to mention is that I didn't shave my hair. So I didn't shave the recipient or the donor area. So they worked through all of my existing hair. Now, using a big punch through an area of miniaturized hair would have been terrible for my native hair. So I suspect that whilst a number of grafts, 450, were transplanted, and they typically, majority of them grew from what I can see, the damage that that would have been caused to a lot of my miniaturized hair would have been great. So yeah, on the train back home, I wore a cap. I remember staying at my mum's house for a week just to try and be away from people, get my head down. I do remember often the pain during the course of the day was getting quite difficult to manage, so I took painkillers. I remember sleeping a lot during that week, and that's really about all I remember about that first procedure. I don't recall the moment, but I must have asked for a 6-month review, or they asked me for a 6-month review, and that was when on 21st of January 1997 I went to go and see Dr. May, and he determined the procedure had gone extremely well. His plan was to use another 400 grafts. I don't know where they were going to go, but another 400 grafts to add more density, and that was going to be at a price of £1,500. He was going to charge me the same number for fewer grafts the second time round. Perhaps he didn't think he could fit any more in at the time. But I do remember the feeling of, this has been a disappointment. This has not been a success. I've got a scar at the back of my head. I remember the pain from that. I remember the experience of not being listened to. There was no proper consultation about my hairline. It was just drawn. It was crooked. Now, I have very few photographs from back then. People just didn't take photographs. People didn't carry a smartphone around in their pocket. The only time you ever took a camera out was really if you were doing something special or going on holiday. And I was pretty self-conscious about my hair, as you probably imagine. So taking pictures of myself around that time is very limited, but I do have a few. But I have, incredibly, some camcorder footage from a few months after my first hair transplant. I vividly remember looking at what I was seeing on a TV. So I was holding the camcorder over my head, trying to look for signs of transplanted hair amongst all my thinning hair. And remember seeing these little stumps spaced apart. What I can see of my reaction in this video is that I can see that I've started to perspire a little bit. I've started to become quite anxious. I think that was the moment when it really dawned on me that this surgery was never, ever going to be successful. And that really was the moment when I began to understand the limitations of this procedure. So I've got some later footage, and I think this was again months afterwards, and I think my hair does look slightly better. I remember having one comment that my hair looked a bit thicker, but that was a very brief moment. That was somewhere between, 6 to 12 months after surgery. And as they hadn't shaved my hair, I was able to conceal a lot of what had taken place. But yeah, I went back to work a week after surgery, and there were still scabs. And I remember being at work with my boss standing over me, looking down whilst I was on the phone. And I felt so self-conscious at that moment that he might spot that I've had something done. It was an all-male environment, so there would have been plenty of piss taken if they'd realised I'd had a transplant. I'd already had the comments about, you're losing hair, you're going a bit thin, or you're getting a bit of a bald spot. I'd had all that. So going back to this letter, the surgery had gone extremely well. Dr. May wanted to perform a second procedure. I wasn't so sure. And that's when I started looking at other hair transplant doctors. I needed to find a doctor that was prepared to move more hair because I really needed it. I was aggressively still losing my hair after this first procedure. It had given me a small benefit, but that benefit was disappearing already. And I knew that I was already on a conveyor belt to my next surgery. And you'd think that things wouldn't have got any worse for me, but they did. In my second hair transplant, things were about to get a whole lot worse for me, and my decision to try and find another surgeon blew up in my face.